Hey guys, my name's Aviva, and today I'm going to be sharing with you all of my favorite romances, my current favorite romances though, because at the end of the day, my tastes are always changing. And if you asked me this time last year, I'm sure I would have had a completely different stack. So at the very moment that I'm making this video, this is my top 10. These are the books that when I was looking in my library to pick out my favorites, these are the ones that just called out to me. I have so many more books than this that I absolutely love, and I gave an easy 5 stars. But at the end of the day, all the books that I'm about to share with you are the ones that they stand out a little bit more. Maybe it's just something like, about me, or I actually think the book is completely perfect. But for one reason or another, these are my favorites, and today I am going to be sharing them with you. So I just wanted to say I'm not really going to go very deep into what these books are actually about. I kind of just want to focus on why I specifically love these books and why they made it onto this list. This list also isn't in a specific order. I literally just grabbed them by going through my shelf, and we're literally going through them from the way that I grabbed them. So this isn't oh, the first one is my 10th one and the last one's my number one. I don't have an order, and I don't want to put them in an order just because I don't think that any of them are comparable. I love them each for different reasons, and they're all together on the same line of loving, if you know what I mean. So, also very obviously, all of these got an easy 5 stars. I wouldn't have put a current favorite on this list if it wasn't an easy 5 star. So I 100% recommend them. And if you don't like one of these books, that's totally okay, because everybody has different tastes and everybody's looking for something else in a book. And these just specifically all fit into what I am looking for in a book. And that's why they made it onto this list. So whatever. With that said, the first book I wanted to share with you is actually Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, which if you've been with me for half a second, this wouldn't be surprising to you. I'm actually in the middle of doing a reread of this. I'm currently, at the time I'm making this video, about halfway through my 3rd reread of this series. Well, I'm not halfway through the full series. I'm halfway through the first book on my 3rd round of rereading it. So I actually had read this series for the first time right when I got back into reading as an adult. So I read it maybe around 3 years ago. It was my introduction to Sarah J. Maas. And once I found this, it opened up a whole new world for me. And I have thought about this series nonstop for the past 3 years. There's a reason why I read it about once every single year. I have to wait long enough to forget it enough to then crave it enough to be able to reread it without feeling like I want to skim or anything like that. So at the moment, I am officially doing my reread of it, and I'm loving it. At the end of the day, I don't know if I would have loved this as much if I read it for the first time now, but because I read it when I read it, and then it settled in a specific part in my mind, I look back on this series so freaking fondly, and at the end of the day, it still lives up to everything that I remember it being. Whether it's because of my memories of it or whether it's because it's actually that amazing, I love it and I die for it. And yes, I definitely have some books in this series that I like more than others. At the end of the day, I think from beginning to end, it's just amazing. And I really, truly do love this series to death. And then obviously after that, I'm going to have to put A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas, which is the 2nd book in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. So I'm specifically putting this book alone into this top 10 video because I like the series in general, the entire series. But at the end of the day, I really just like it because of this book. If this book didn't exist in this series, I wouldn't put that series on my top 10. Throne of Glass, I love the entire series from beginning to end. And while I do have more favorites, I still love each book for what it is. And when I look at this series, I do enjoy each book, but I don't necessarily love each book. I really do enjoy book 1, but then when you get to book 2, book 1 is basically just a joke. So obviously book 2 is going to win over book 1. And then book 3 is just a war book. And I personally wish that this series had ended at book 3. So I don't even want to think about the rest of the books, even though I kind of enjoyed them for what they were, but I also have a lot I could complain about the other books. So I really, when I think about this series, I'm just thinking about A Court of Mist and Fury, and therefore I specifically wanted to put this book in this video. And why do I like this book? Because of Rysand, obviously. But besides for the romance, one thing that I love about this book when I when I have to think about it and reread it in my brain is that there were so many amazing scenes in this book from beginning to end. I don't think there was a lull in this book at all. This was so jam-packed with amazing amazing moments, and yet nothing was like overshadowed on top of each other. It worked so well. And I feel like I don't often find that in a book. Like there's always like, a couple of standout moments when you're thinking about a book of like, oh my God, yeah, I remember that scene. And oh yeah, I remember that scene. But like when I'm thinking about this book, there are so many scenes that I can point out. Like I remember the first time that I read this book, I just replayed it in my head and tried to put all of the scenes in order, and I would always mix it up, and then I'd have to like look through the book and be like, well, which one came first? And just the idea of that, I have so many fond memories of this book, from the romance, the relationship, and everything that just happened in this book. I freaking love it to death. I don't even know if I like this book specifically more than I like the entire Throne of Glass series. Like that's what I was saying. I can't put something in order because I love them each for what they are, and I definitely love this book to death. Next, I wanted to share with you one of my favorite series of all time, which is also the longest series that I've loved, like if that makes sense. Like I've loved this series for the absolute longest. And that series is the Trial series by Amanda Hocking. So it's Switched, Torn, and then Ascend. So book 1 and then book 2 and 3. And just look at like how beat up this book is. That just shows you how much I love it. I can't even tell you how many times I have read this series over the years. I must have found it maybe like in middle school. My sister had bought it. She absolutely loved it. And I would always read the books that my siblings already owned, just because like I wasn't very good at like picking out my own books. So I would just reread this series over and over. I really can't tell you how many times I have read this entire series and loved it from beginning to end. This was like my OG like fantasy romance series. Like you're following like this changeling, and she ends up having like a romance with a bodyguard, and then she has a romance with a prince, and there's like wars and magic and just everything that I love. I originally fell in love with it because of this series, and it just holds such a special place in my heart. And happens to be, I actually did a reread of it I think like sometime within the last year, and when I did it this past time, I realized that I know this entire series from beginning to end a little bit too well, that I don't think I can reread this series again. If not, I can't reread it anytime in the next couple of years, because I had taken like a 2-year break between doing my rereads when I did it like, a couple of months ago. And it was already too familiar for me that I don't want to ruin the book by like, reading it when it's like, I know it too well. But that just shows you how much I actually love this series, because I've read it so much that I'm reading it and I just know what the characters are going to say next. So I highly recommend reading this series if you're into fantasy romances. Like I think that it's such a hidden gem, and I can't rave about it enough. All right, so that's it for all of the fantasy books that made it on this list. And it kind of makes sense that there were only 3, because when I look at those books, like they really are my top 3 fantasy books. And at the end of the day, I don't really read fantasy anymore. So it kind of makes sense that like, there weren't a lot of them on this list, even though like fantasy does hold a very special place in my heart, because it was like the beginning of my reading journey. But whatever. With that said, the next book I wanted to share with you is The Deal by Elle Kennedy. So this is the first book in the Off-Campus series, and I am specifically sharing with you the first book, because I did read all 8 books in the series, like, the original series and then the spinoff. And while I do like a lot of the books in this series, nothing ever compared to the first book. So I am specifically sharing with you this one specifically, like not the entire series, but I mean, I like this book not only because of like, the relationship and everything that actually happened in this book, which I think was like a fully great story, but it is mostly because I feel like it was the start of the journey that of what I read now. Like this was the first sports romance I read. Before this, I wasn't really reading like anything spicy. I wasn't really reading a lot of adult stuff or anything along those lines. And when I read this series, I just realized that there's like so much more out there. If I just would read books with naked men on the covers, like who knows what I'll find. Like it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like an extremely spicy book, even though I'm not like against that or anything, but like this was just the book that made me like flip a switch in my head of like, I think I have to try all of these books that I've always been staying away from just because like they intimidate me. And I'll forever be grateful to this book because of that. And happens to be, I don't know if I would love it as much if I read it for the first time now as, when I read it back then, because I obviously fell in love with it, like, at a certain time in my life when like, I wasn't necessarily comparing it to a lot of other books. And maybe if I did read it for the first time now, I wouldn't love it as much. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because when I read it, I absolutely loved it. And therefore I'm putting it on this list, even though maybe one day I'm going to read it and it just won't live up to the expectations that I had put on it. But like, I'll never know until I do a reread of it. And until then, it still is one of my favorites for the time that I read it and everything along those lines. You know what I mean? All right, so next up, I wanted to share with you the Come Back to Me series by Mila Grace. So this is a collection of 5 books, and overall, I love this series. There are definitely ones that I love more in the series than others. Like specifically, like let's take out book 4 from the series. I'm not counting that as like on my favorites list, and probably we could even take out book 5. So really, book 1, 2, 3 in this series are my favorites that I am adding into this video. So it's like Come Back to Me, and then Stay With Me, and then Run Away With Me. So these I think are YA. They might be considered new adult, but I really don't know. But anyway, I had read this series a while ago, like less than a year ago, but also like before I started in the sports romances and the dark romances and everything like that. So I was definitely in a different headspace when I read these books, and I don't know if like, they would entertain me as much as they did like now than when I read them, because obviously tastes change and I am in like a different mindset of reading than I was when I read these. But at the same time, when I read these, I loved them. And when I look at these books, I still have such fond memories of them. And there's something that I would consider rereading. Like I do want to reread these just to like know if they do live up to like, what I remember them being and everything like that. But I remember when I read these, I loved how focused on the relationship these were. So these are all dual POV. And the entire time you're reading this, you just get to see both characters always interacting with each other, and you get to see their relationship grow in such a perfect way. And in all of these books, you're kind of following like a more serious topic. Like in book 1, this guy, he's currently on leave, like from the military, like he's part of the army, and like he basically falls in love with his brother's best friend. No, with his best friend's little sister. Like it's one of those relationships while he's home for like, a month or whatever. And then he's gonna have to go back, and like it's so scary like seeing him go back. And obviously a lot of stuff happens, and I definitely recommend looking up some trigger warnings for this. But like, it's that type of series where there's such an amazing romance in it, but also like there's so much more serious stuff going on. Like in book 2, the guy, he was wounded in the military, and now he's like in a rehabilitation center, and he's gonna fall in love with a girl that's like interning there. And in book 3, there's some like, sexual assault trauma stuff that's happening, and that happens to be, it's like a hockey romance. It's not a military romance, but it's still, there's always like this underlying like, serious topic going on, but at the same time, like it doesn't necessarily feel like a heavy book. There's just a couple of moments where like, your heart's gonna kind of just like drop. And I love those type of books. I love a book that it can make me cry, but also I can have a smile on my face for like 90% of the time. And I fell in love with these books because of that. And happens to be, there was a time when I was reading, and I was always like, I was reading a lot of contemporary romances, and sometimes when you read those books, they aren't 100% focused on the relationship. And I've slowly come to terms with the fact that I'm just a relationship addict. I just want to see these two people fall in love, and I really don't care about the mumbo jumble on the side. Like, I don't care about the rest of their lives, and yes, it's needed to fill in the book and make it what it is, and I don't usually like mind reading a little bit of stuff here and there, but if we go chapters without seeing both characters, interact, then I'm gonna get bored, and I don't really care for whatever it is that's going on when the relationship isn't happening. And these were one of those first books that I read where I realized that I just need to read dual POV books, and I just need to find books that are more focused on relationships. And therefore, I'm forever going to be grateful to these books, because it kind of like flipped a switch in my head of making me realize like what's really important to me when I read a book. And at the end of the day, I want to read what I want to read. And this is one of those books that it made me realize that. Next up, the book that I'm sure you guys are waiting for, being like, where the hell is it? It should have been first, is the Addicted / Calloway Sisters series by Krista and Becca Ritchie. So this is a collection of 10 books. And again, I'm not really going to talk about the books, but I will have a video linked down below in case you are interested in reading them, because I have like a whole how-to, what it's about, everything you need to know about the books. Like I made a whole video on it. So I'll have it linked in the description below in case you're interested in reading this series. But I just love this series because of how invested I was able to get into the characters. Like you're following 10 books, and it's all one story, and it's 6 characters and 3 romances. And then there's even like, an extra romance, put in at the end. So like you could technically consider it like 4 romances. I don't know, whatever. Either way, I just love how character driven this story is. Like, yes, there is a plot, but it's a much slower plot, and you're kind of just like following all of these characters, and you're watching them grow. You're watching their friendships happen. You're watching everything everything just like happen in their lives, and you kind of just get to go along for the ride with them. And I am an extremely character driven person over a plot person, and that's why this series worked so well with me, because I was just able to fall in love with every single one of these characters because they were all so different. They all had their own personalities, their own voice, and I loved everything about them. And because of that, I love this series to death. I feel like these characters are real to me. Like, I feel like they live like one state away, and if I wanted to go meet them, I just have to go drive over and stalk, like, superheroes and scones for a little bit until one of them shows up. Like, that is how real they felt to me. And at the end of the day, that is what I'm looking for in a series. I want to fall in love with the characters. I want to be able to cry for them. I want to be able to smile for them. And I was able to do that for this series. So from beginning to end, I absolutely love every character in this series. I love this series to death, and I don't have any complaints about this series. Obviously, yes, there are some couples that I like more than others, and there are some books that I like more than others, but it's kind of like Throne of Glass, where from beginning to end, I just loved the story like wholeheartedly. Next, I have the Ravenhood series by Kate Stewart. So this is the first book, but there's also Exodus and then The Finish Line. And I love this entire series to death. It was one of those like first spicier books that I read. Like, this was one of like, the first ones that I read that I'm just like, I just need more and more of this. Like, and it still is one of those like spicier books. Like, it's still on like my top tier of like, the most intense stuff that I read. And I have read more intense stuff than this, but this is still one that like stands out to me. And I just remember when I read this book, I fell so hard for everything about this book. There's so much like mystery and questions going on that I was intrigued the whole time because I just wanted to know what happened. I was so freaking confused the whole time, and I'm like, what the hell am I reading? But then by the time I got to the end of book 3 and it all made sense, I'm like, wow, how the hell did that happen? Like, how did all of a sudden I understand the entire thing? And I have to give props to this author for somehow creating this story the way that she created it. And then besides the actual storyline, which I am a huge fan of, and I was very like wowed by it, I do love all of the characters in this series. Like, I mean, I fell in love with all of the relationships that happened. This was, I think, one of the first threesomes that I ever read. Like, it was one of the first type of relationships. This was like the first one that I read of that type of relationship. If you read this series, then you know what I mean. And I love it for what it was. Like, it was something that introduced me to like a whole new world. And besides for that, I loved it. Like, I remember the emotions that I felt for reading this book as if I read it yesterday. And I must have read it like months and months ago. I remember I made a reading vlog for it, and I'm sure I will cringe if I rewatched it now, but I will have it linked down below for you in case you did want to see all of my emotions while reading this. But like, I remember being like, my heart is like pounding and like my stomach is dropping just thinking about this series. And that just proves as to how much I loved it. Like, it's currently raining outside, and the only thing I could keep thinking about is like, we love rainy days, don't we, baby? And I feel like I want to like just bawl and like sit in a corner and cry because I just think about that, and my heart, it just drops every time. And that just shows me how much I fell in love with this series and these characters, because they made me laugh, they made me cry, they made my heart hurt in all different types of ways. And I loved it. And I do understand why, like, not a lot of people would love this series. Like, I see the divide of like, people are either obsessed with it or people just don't get it. And I find that to be totally okay. But at the end of the day, this series worked for me, and I cannot wait to reread this, because once I forget it enough that I won't feel the urge to like want to skim or anything like that, I will be reading this series. Like, I'm going to do a reread of it like within the next couple of months. Like, you have my word on that. So this next one is the 8th book that I'm sharing with you, like series / book. You know what I mean? Like, I've tried to choose like 10 overall, and this next one is kind of like my favorite author. Even though, like, I mean, can I say she's my favorite author? I do have a lot of favorite authors, but at the end of the day, I think that this author is my favorite, and her name is Mariana Zapata. So I've officially read 8 books by her. I think that she only has 13 books out. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 more books that I have not read by her that I don't think I'm going to read, because this, like, the tropes in them specifically aren't my vibe. Like, I mean, they're all on the screen right now of the books that I've read, and I've loved every single one of these to death. Yes, I can put them in a more like better order, that it's like, oh, I like this one more than others, but at the end of the day, every single one of these got a 5 stars for me, and I loved them so freaking much. They're all slow burn romances. They all have like their own thing going on, but at the end of the day, they all gave me me the same feeling. And I think about these books all the time. Like sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to reread one, but then I can't choose which one I want to reread because I kind of want to reread all of them. And I don't want to reread all of them because that's going to take way too much time. So then I don't reread any of them. But like my point is that I love these books. I think about them all the time. And I feel like I was about to say something and then I like lost track. But in my head, I was thinking how there's 4 more books that like, you know, this author has written that I haven't read before. And I don't think I want to read them because the first 2 are like her 2 originals that she has like, you know, written. And I just don't think they're going to vibe with me. Like one I think is about like a porn star and one's about like, you know, a musician or something. And I happen to like, I just don't want to read them. Like I've seen a lot of reviews on them and I don't want to read them. And then there's another book called The Best Thing, and that's a second chance romance. And I am not a second chance romance person. So I don't know if I'm going to read that book, only because not only like am I not a second chance romance person, but I have seen a lot of people say that they are a second chance romance person, and yet that book kind of like let them down. So I really don't think I should read it so that I don't like taint my memory of all of Mariana Zapata books. And then there's one other book which is called what's the book called? It's like not Under Lock, because Under Lock is on the screen. It's like the football one, the one with like Jax, like Winnipeg's best friend that like we had met in his book, like whatever. Anyway, there's one more book, and I don't think I want to read that book because it is it's not a second chance romance, but I think it's like we were friends once and then we became strangers, then we're friends again. And I don't love that trope either. And I have heard that like, you know, it's not the best book that she's written, and I don't know, I've seen a lot about it and I just don't know if I want to read it. But basically, besides for those 4 books where I'm just like iffy about, like maybe I will read them one day, maybe I won't, I don't know, all the books on the screen I have read and I've loved to freaking death. I never realized how much of a slow burn fan I am until I read her books. And it's funny because even after reading her books, it took me a while to realize how much I appreciate the slow burn of her books. Like I remember the first book I read was, you know, All Roads Lead Here, and I loved it, but I was like, I don't know if I want to read any more of her books because like it was a little bit too slow for me. And then I read like either Winnipeg or Culty, one of those next, and I'm like, okay, well, these are getting better, and like I liked them a lot more, so let's keep going. And then I just kept going and I kept going, and I fell in love with each and every one that I read more and more. And Mariana Zapata has given me an appreciation to slow burn romances, all the way to the point where sometimes I read a book now and I'm like, that was way too quick, like 100 pages. And then there's their first kiss. Like, I'm sorry, but I needed 400 more for that to happen. Like, she has turned me over to like a certain side of the type of reading. And I love her style of books. And the only thing that I really have to complain about with her books in general is that like the characters don't really get together until the end of all of her books. Like literally like within the last 50 pages, you finally get their first kiss and, you know, their first like explicit scene, and like they're finally together, and then the book kind of ends. And that is something that I don't love about her books, because I'm always like, her books are like 600-700 pages long, and I'm always like itching for like 200 more pages. Like give me just a little bit more. Like I always think that they end a little bit too quickly. But I mean, that's not really something to complain about, because at the end of the day, it shows how much I love every single one of her books, that I've already read 700 pages and I'll read 700 pages more without like questions asked. So I love all of these books. I'm counting this as like one book overall. So like, you know, this is like my number 8. Well, it's not in order, but like this is the 8th one that I'm mentioning. All of these books I'm just jumbling into one, because no way in hell would I be able to choose just one out of all 8 of these. So anyway, with that said, next up, I wanted to share with you the Sinner of Saints series by L.J. Shen. So I am holding up book 1, which is Vicious, but I also am specifically putting in book 3 and book 4 in the series. I probably should have grabbed it, but I was a little bit too lazy, and now it's too late. So Vicious, Scandalous, and Bane are all in my top favorites. So there is also book 2, which is Ruckus, and I personally didn't love it because first of all, it's a second chance romance, and I'm not a fan of second chance romances, but also I do think that it kind of counteracted some stuff in this book, and it made me look at this book a little bit differently, that I kind of just wish that like it didn't exist, because I now look at this relationship and like stuff that happened in this book like a little bit differently than I did when I originally read it. So I'm not the hugest fan of book 2, but if we forget about book 2, then I really do love the rest of the series. So this was the first dark romance like / taboo romance series that I ever read. So book 1 is a bully romance, and then book book 3 is an age gap forbidden workplace environment romance. And then book 4 is very heavy on trigger warnings. Like this girl was sexually assaulted, and then this guy is basically like paid to be her friend and try to like get her to crack out of her shell. And then obviously they're going to have a relationship. So it does have a lot of like lying going on in that book. And I usually don't like lying, but like it kind of just worked for me at the time that I read it. And I just loved this book. I actually loved it so much that I actually have recently reread this book. I don't remember when, maybe like a month or two ago. And I still really did love it. Like maybe I didn't love it as much as I loved it the first time, but I still loved it enough that I'm still putting it in this, video, because I have very fond memories of this series. And I really did enjoy it. It was another one of those like first series that I read where it's like, we're looking at dual POV and we're always focused on the relationship. There's not much else happening besides for that. And it was one of those books that like were just in the initial moments of my turning point in reading. And I'll forever have a really fond memory of this series. I just remember when I was reading this, like I was so giddy the entire time. I'm just like, oh my God, what is that I found? Like, a bully romance. I've never read a bully romance before. And I was so into it. And then the age gap romance, that was the first age gap romance I ever read, like Scandalous. And I just remember, like, I remember having a smile on my face the entire time that I read this series, just thinking about like, oh my God, what have I found? I need to find more of this. So because of that, I'm putting this on my favorites, because not only does it have such a a serious spot in my reading journey of like, something that just changed the way that I read, but also like it was good enough that I still plan to reread this. Like I reread book 1 and I still loved it. And I definitely plan to reread book 3 and book 4 when like the mood hits. So that just shows you how much I loved it. Like I loved the romances, I loved the vibes of this book, and I love the path that it put me on to the books that I read now. And the last book that I'm going to share with you is the first mafia romance that I ever read, which was The Sweetest, Oblivion by Danielle Laurie. So there are currently 3 books in this series, and I've read all 3, and I'm specifically putting in book 1, which is The Arranged Marriage. So I did very much like book 3 in this series as well, but I definitely liked book 1 more. So I'm specifically putting in book 1. So this was the first mafia romance that I ever read. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. Like, I started trying dark romances, taboo romances, things along those lines, and I was finally ready to start a mafia book. And thankfully I picked this one up first because I fell so hard for the vibe of mafia romances. And then the fact that this was an arranged marriage, which I'm pretty sure was like maybe the first arranged marriage that I've ever read. Like I was very into like, fake dating and stuff along those lines, but I don't think I really read an arranged marriage that was like this book until this book. Like I have read ones after that, but this was the first book that I read that was this vibe, and I just loved it. I loved the darker feeling that it gave me. Like everything was just a little bit more intense, a little bit more dramatic, but also like we were still living in the same world, except it somewhat gave me like the feeling that I get when I'm reading a fantasy book, because like this doesn't feel real, except that it very likely is real. Like it's probably happening. Like, I'm in upstate New York, things like mafias all around me, like, I don't know about that, but I know that there are like biker gangs around me and stuff along those lines. And I don't know, it kind of gave me the vibe of like, this isn't real, but it is real. Like it's happening under the radar in our real world. And it's so much darker and more intense. And the romance was amazing, and the tension and everything along the lines of like this book, I just absolutely loved. And I'm definitely looking forward to doing a reread of this book in the future. Like I probably will never reread the second book in this series, but I do plan to reread the first one. And if it does like go really well, then I'll probably reread the third one as well. And then when the fourth one comes out, definitely I'll be pre-ordering it. So yeah, I love this book. It has a very special place in my heart. First mafia romance I ever read. And yeah, that is about it. So I'm saying again that this was in no particular order. Like just because that book came last doesn't mean that it was like my least favorite. But with that said, that is my current favorite romances. These are all the books that without a doubt I recommend. If you wanted to get into the type of books that I read and you haven't read one of these books yet, I recommend it without a doubt. And if you don't end up liking it, that's okay, because everybody has their own taste in books. And just because something worked for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. But if you have the same type of taste as me, then maybe you will enjoy all the books in this stack. So anyway, let me know if any of the books that I mentioned in this video are some of your favorite books, or give me some of your favorite books in general, because I'm always looking for good recommendations. And if you have like an all-time favorite book that you haven't seen me read before, I would love to check it out. So leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed watching this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you're not currently subscribed to my channel. And anyway, thank you so much for watching and clicking on my video. And until next time, enjoy reading.